I didn't choose the wrong life. That's what makes this so difficult to admit. I chose the life that made sense. Every decision I made could be explained, defended, justified. If someone asked why I was where I was, I had an answer that sounded reasonable, practical, mature. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't impulsive. I didn't chase fantasies that might collapse under pressure. I built something solid. From the outside, my life looked exactly the way a life is supposed to look when you're doing things right. There was progress, stability, a clear sequence of steps. One thing led to another without chaos. I didn't shock anyone. I didn't scare myself. That felt like success. I remember when I first learned to value what made sense. It didn't happen all at once. It happened through small corrections. Someone questioned my ideas. Someone warned me about risk. Someone reminded me how fragile opportunities are and how easy it is to lose everything. I listened. Each time I adjusted myself to be more reasonable, I felt relief. Relief is powerful. It rewards you immediately. It teaches you that choosing safety feels better than choosing uncertainty. Over time, relief became my compass. If something felt exciting but unstable, I hesitated. If something felt meaningful but risky, I delayed. If something didn't fit into a clear explanation, I softened it until it did. I told myself I was learning how the world works. Slowly, my life became quieter. Not peaceful quieter. The kind of quiet where nothing is obviously wrong, but nothing pulls at you either. I stopped feeling torn between possibilities. I stopped wrestling with direction. I stopped asking dangerous questions. People trusted me. They relied on me. They said I was grounded. Someone who doesn't overcomplicate things. Someone who chooses wisely. I accepted those descriptions because they confirmed I was doing the right thing. Inside, something was thinning. Not painfully. Gradually. I didn't wake up unhappy. I woke up prepared. Prepared to get through the day efficiently. Prepared to respond correctly. Prepared to maintain what I had built. My life didn't require passion to function. It required consistency. So I gave it consistency. Days passed smoothly. Weeks folded into each other. When I looked back, time felt compressed, like entire stretches of my life had happened without leaving a clear impression. I could describe what I did, but not what I felt. Feeling wasn't necessary. I remember standing still one evening, doing absolutely nothing important, and realizing how little of me was actually required to keep my life running. I could be tired, distracted, emotionally distant, and nothing would stop. The structure held without me. That realization scared me. Not because something was wrong, but because nothing was demanding my presence. I had optimized my life to the point where I was optional. I tried to tell myself this was adulthood. That intensity fades, that life becomes quieter when you make smart choices. That meaning is overrated and stability is the real reward. But something inside me resisted that explanation. I started noticing moments when I felt strangely disconnected, as if I were watching my own life from a slight distance. Conversations sounded rehearsed. Achievements felt neutral. Even rest didn't restore me, because I wasn't exhausted from effort, I was exhausted from absence. At night, when everything slowed down, a dull pressure settled in my chest. Not anxiety. Not sadness. Just the awareness that something essential wasn't being used. I would lie there and wonder when I had last felt fully inside my own life. The answer kept moving further back. I realized that I had been choosing what made sense for so long that I no longer knew what made me feel alive. Sense had replaced instinct. Explanation had replaced desire. Safety had replaced direction. And the most unsettling part was this: nothing forced me into this life. I walked into it willingly, one sensible step at a time. There was no moment I could point to and say, that's when I lost myself. There was no dramatic mistake. Just a long sequence of choices that made sense individually and erased something collectively. I hadn't failed. I hadn't collapsed. I hadn't ruined anything. I had simply traded my life for one that worked. And one evening, standing in the quiet that followed another perfectly reasonable day, a thought surfaced that refused to leave. If this life continues exactly as it is, will I ever feel like it's actually mine? I didn't have an answer. And for the first time, the life that made sense started to feel like the wrong one. Once that question took hold, will this life ever feel like mine? The answers I had relied on for years stopped working. Logic didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. It could explain everything except the quiet resistance growing inside me. I began to notice how carefully I had edited myself to fit the life that made sense. How often I chose restraint over honesty. How instinctively I softened my reactions so nothing felt excessive or inconvenient. I had learned to be appropriate in every situation and invisible to myself. People praised that. They said I was balanced. Reliable. Someone who didn't create problems. I accepted those words because they turned my self-erasure into something admirable. They gave my silence a moral shape. Inside, something tightened. My body noticed before my mind fully did. Sleep stopped feeling restorative. I woke up tired, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was bracing for another day that didn't require me to be present. Ordinary moments carried a heaviness I couldn't name: standing in line, answering messages, listening to conversations that felt rehearsed. I told myself it was stress. Everyone is stressed. But stress usually comes from effort. What I felt came from restraint. I realized how much energy went into maintaining a life that made sense. Staying composed. Staying reasonable. Staying aligned with expectations I had never questioned. Leaving would have required one difficult decision. Staying required thousands of small ones, made daily, quietly. Each one cost me something. I started grieving without knowing exactly what I was grieving. Not a specific dream or opportunity, but identity. The loss of a self that once reacted strongly, wanted deeply, trusted instinct even when it couldn't be justified. That version of me felt distant now. Almost irresponsible. Late at night, I replayed old memories with a new lens. I searched for the moment when sense replaced self. When I stopped asking what felt right and started asking what could be defended. There was no single turning point. No dramatic failure. Just a long sequence of reasonable adjustments. I almost said no. I almost chose differently. I almost trusted myself. Each time, I told myself I was being smart. Each time, relief followed. And relief slowly trained me to believe that avoiding uncertainty was the same as avoiding harm. That belief hollowed me out. The moral dilemma became impossible to ignore. If I continued living this way, nothing catastrophic would happen. That was the promise of sense. I would remain stable, respected, intact. I would age inside a life that worked. If I chose differently, if I chose something that didn't immediately make sense, everything would become uncertain. I would risk failure, disappointment, regret. I would have to confront the possibility that I had waited too long to live any other way. That possibility terrified me. Some nights, the idea of disappearing crossed my mind. Not dying, disappearing. Stepping away from the life that had been built around my compliance. Starting somewhere I wasn't already defined by reason and restraint. The idea scared me. It also felt like oxygen. That contradiction stayed with me. I tried to argue myself back into logic. I reminded myself how dangerous impulsive choices can be. How many people ruin their lives by following feelings. How irreversible decisions are. Those arguments had always been enough before. Now they felt borrowed. Then came a moment so ordinary I almost missed it. Someone asked me, casually, without pressure or expectation, "Are you happy with this?" I opened my mouth to answer automatically. To give the reasonable response. To say something neutral that would close the conversation. Instead, I hesitated. The silence felt heavier than any answer. In that pause, something became painfully clear: I didn't know. I had spent so long building a life that made sense that I had never asked whether it felt like mine. That realization frightened me more than the idea of failure. Because failure assumes intention. I understood then that my life wasn't wrong. It wasn't broken. It wasn't unhappy. It was misaligned. Logic had guided me well, but it had guided me away from myself. For the first time, staying felt like an active choice instead of a default. And once you see that, neutrality disappears. Every day you continue becomes a decision to keep choosing sense over self. I didn't know yet what I would do. But I knew this: if I kept living a life that made sense to everyone else, I would eventually wake up inside something I couldn't recognize, not because I was trapped, but because I had never practiced choosing myself. And that felt like the most reasonable way to lose a life without ever noticing it was gone. I didn't destroy the life that made sense. I stepped out of it slowly, the way you step out of a role you've played for so long that you almost believe it's your face. The first thing I chose didn't look heroic. It didn't even look important from the outside. I chose something that felt right without being able to fully explain why. No spreadsheet could justify it. No careful reasoning could guarantee the outcome. And that terrified me. For years, I had relied on explanation as protection. If I could explain a decision, I could defend it. If I could defend it, I wouldn't have to face the possibility that I was wrong. Choosing something that didn't make sense removed that shield entirely. I stood there, aware that once I acted, there would be consequences that belonged to me alone. Fear reacted instantly. It reminded me how late I was. How much of my life had already been shaped by reason instead of desire. It told me that the step wouldn't recover what I had lost, it would only expose it. That if I failed now, I wouldn't be able to blame circumstances or timing. Some nights, that fear almost won. Some nights, logic begged me to return. Return to the life that worked. Return to being reasonable. Return to safety. But something had shifted. I could feel the difference between safety and surrender now. I could feel how much of myself I had traded for predictability. And once you see that trade clearly, continuing to pay the price becomes unbearable. So I chose. Not once, repeatedly. Choosing myself didn't feel empowering. It felt awkward. Unstable. Like walking without rehearsing every step first. I hesitated. I doubted. I changed my mind more than once. The part of me that had been trained to value coherence over honesty didn't disappear quietly. But I was present. For the first time in years, my days felt connected to my actions. Even when things went wrong, especially when they went wrong, I knew why they were happening. They weren't accidents. They weren't momentum. They were mine. That ownership was heavy. I lost the comfort of being easily understood. Some people didn't recognize me anymore. The version of me that fit neatly into expectations had been easier to accept. This version, uncertain, choosing, occasionally contradictory, created friction. That friction hurt. I lost approval I hadn't realized I depended on. I lost the quiet praise that comes from being sensible and low risk. I lost the excuse of saying, "This is just how things turned out." But in its place, something unfamiliar appeared. Alignment. Not happiness, alignment. The sense that even when I was afraid, even when I regretted specific outcomes, I wasn't betraying myself in the process. My life stopped feeling like something that happened to me and started feeling like something I was inside of again. Time changed. Days slowed down. Not because they were easier, but because they mattered. Moments left impressions. Decisions carried weight. Even uncertainty felt different, not like a threat, but like proof that I was actually participating. I grieved what I had lost. That grief didn't disappear when I started choosing. It still visits me. I mourn the years spent living a life that made sense while slowly abandoning the one that felt like mine. But I no longer let that grief decide for me. I learned something I wish I had understood earlier: a life that makes sense can still be a life that isn't yours. Logic is a powerful tool, but it's a terrible compass. It can tell you how to move efficiently, not where you belong. I didn't burn my life down. I didn't escape into something dramatic. I didn't suddenly become fearless. What I did was simpler. I stopped asking whether my life made sense and started asking whether it required me to be present. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in the life that works, the life that looks right, the life that everyone understands, I want to tell you to abandon it recklessly. Not every reasonable life is a mistake. But ask yourself one honest question, without defending the answer: does this life belong to you, or does it just function well because one day, quietly, without collapse or crisis, you may realize that you did everything right, and still lived someone else's life? I lived the life that made sense. Choosing the one that was mine didn't make everything better. It made everything real. And reality, with all its fear, cost, and uncertainty, was still worth more than a life that only ever made sense.